Question 33 of Secunda Secundae is on fraternal correction, and this has to do with correcting somebody for their good or for the good of the common good, everybody in general, and when and under what circumstances we should do so. And they're actually quite interesting questions that are asked here. And we begin these 8 articles with article number 1, whether fraternal correction is an act of charity. And Thomas says the correction of a wrongdoer is a remedy which should be employed against man's sin. Now, a man's sin may be considered in 2 ways. First, as being harmful to the sinner himself. Secondly, as conducing to the harm of others. Okay, so this has to do with, does it have to do with the individual or the broader community, by hurting or scandalizing them, or by being detrimental to the common good, the justice of which is disturbed by that man's sin. Consequently, the correction of a wrongdoer is twofold: one which applies a remedy to the sin considered as an evil to the sinner himself. This is fraternal correction properly so called, which is directed to the amendment of the sinner. Now, to do away with anyone's evil is the same as to procure his good, and to procure a person's good is an act of charity whereby we wish and do our friend well. Consequently, fraternal correction also is an act of charity. All right, so this is something that oftentimes we have a hard time with because we don't want to offend anybody. We don't want to tell them that they're doing something wrong, and so most of us try to shy away from any kind of fraternal correction. Article 2 says whether fraternal correction is a matter of precept. Does that mean, is it a law? Do we have to do this? He says fraternal correction is a matter of precept. We must observe, however, that while the negative precepts of the law forbid sinful acts, the positive precepts inculcate acts of virtue. He says, on the other hand, acts of virtue must not be done anyhow, but by observing the due circumstances which are requisite in order that an act may be virtuous, namely that it be done where, when, and how it ought to be done. Fraternal correction is directed to a brother's amendment, so that it is a matter of precept insofar as it is necessary for that end, and not so far as we have to correct our erring brother in all places and at all times. So in very classic Thomistic fashion, Aquinas very rarely ever gives a black and white answer. There's always circumstances, there's always mitigating factors, and so you really have to read the Summa in that light, in that, like, again, very, very rarely are things absolutely black and white. Article 3, whether fraternal correction belongs only to prelates. The prelates are the leaders of the church, our priests, our bishops, our pope. He says, one is an act of charity which seeks in a special way the recovery of an erring brother by means of a simple warning. Such like correction belongs to anyone who has charity, be he subject or prelate. Okay, so he's saying, no, we all have a right to correct people, but there's another correction which is an act of justice, proposing the common good, which is procured not only by warning one's brother, but also sometimes by punishing him, that others may, through fear, desist from sin. Such a correction belongs only to prelates, whose business is not only to admonish, but also to correct by means of punishments. Okay, so he does make a distinction there. Article 4, whether a man is bound to correct his prelate. Okay, so are we bound to correct our bishop, our priests? He says a subject is not competent to administer to his prelate the correction which is an act of justice through the coercive nature of punishment, but the fraternal correction, which is an act of charity, is within the competency of everyone in respect of any person towards whom he is bound by charity, provided there be something in that person which requires correction. So he's saying, well, we all are our brother's keeper, right? So we all have a responsibility for each other. And so if we see something gone wrong and needs correction, it doesn't really matter who that person is or what his state is. Whether a sinner ought to reprove a wrongdoer. So if somebody is a sinner himself and he sees something wrong, should he correct? Thomas says to correct a wrongdoer belongs to a man insofar as his reason is gifted with right judgment. Now sin does not destroy the good of nature so as to deprive the sinner's reason of all right judgment, and in this respect he may be competent to find fault with others for committing sin. Nevertheless, a previous sin proves somewhat of a hindrance to this correction. And Thomas gives several examples of scandal and pride and a lot of different reasons why it's in principle, yeah, the sinner can correct, but sometimes it's kind of a hard, it doesn't look good, right? Article 6, whether one ought to forbear from correcting someone through fear lest he become worse. The correction of the wrongdoer is twofold, one which belongs to prelates and is directed to the common good, and this has a coercive force. Such correction should not be omitted lest the person corrected be disturbed. The common good is safeguarded in this way, since the order of justice is observed and others are deterred by the one being made an example of. The other fraternal correction is directed to the amendment of the wrongdoer, whom it does not coerce but merely admonishes. Consequently, when it is deemed probable that the sinner will not take the warning, who will become worse, such fraternal correction should be foregone, because the means should be regulated according to the requirement of the end. So he's very pragmatic here. He's saying, if it's not going to do any good, and it's just going to make things worse, then don't do it. Well, the precept of fraternal correction demands that a private admonition should precede denunciation. Because sins may be either public or secret, we have to look at them in both cases. In the case of public sins, a remedy is required not only for the sinner that he may become better, but also for others who know of his sin, lest they become scandalized. Wherefore, such like sins should be denounced in public. On the other hand, in the case of secret sins, it's a different situation. There are other sins which injure not the sinner, they only injure the sinner and maybe one victim, either because he is alone or hurt by a sinner. We ought to safeguard our sinning brother's good name, both because the dishonor of one leads to the dishonor of the other. Since, however, one's conscience should be preferred to a good name, our Lord wished that we should publicly denounce our brother and to deliver his conscience from sin, even though he should forfeit his good name. Therefore, it is evident that the precept requires a secret admonition to precede public denunciation. And the final article is Article 8, whether before the public denunciation witnesses ought to be brought forth. The right way to go from one extreme to another is to pass through the middle space. That's a great principle line there, isn't it? That's a principle line. Now, our Lord wished the beginning of fraternal correction to be hidden when one brother corrects another between this and himself alone, while he wished the end to be public when such a one would be now been denounced to the church. Consequently, it is befitting that a citation of witnesses should be placed between the two extremes, so that at first the brother's sin be indicated to a few who will be of use without being a hindrance, and thus his sin be amended without dishonoring him in public. So it's a very balanced type of approach that Aquinas is using here. I think it's a very good approach, and I appreciate it very much, and I hope you did as well. Thanks for watching. God bless you. Let me fix this. Okay, here we go. All right. God bless you.